The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the reinforced windows of Building 7, the most feared structure at Fort Braxton's Special Operations Training Center. Sarah Chun adjusted her tactical vest as she approached the entrance, her boots echoing against the concrete with each measured step. She had survived 12 weeks of grueling preparation to reach this moment, the final weapons assessment that would determine whether she earned her place among the military's elite or returned home in disgrace. Heavy steel door groaned open, revealing a sterile room that felt more like an operating theater than a training facility. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in an unforgiving white glare. 12 other candidates were already present, their faces masks of barely controlled tension. Sarah recognized most of them: Martinez from the Rangers, Thompson from the Marines, Williams from Special Forces. Each had distinguished themselves in previous conflicts. Each carried themselves with the confidence of proven warriors. At the center of the room stood a single metal table, its surface gleaming under the harsh lights. But it was the man beside it who commanded everyone's attention. Instructor. Marcus Reeves was a legend whispered about in barracks across 3 continents. 6 feet of lean muscle wrapped in digital camouflage. His weathered face bore the kind of scars that came from real combat, not training accidents. His pale blue eyes seemed to catalog every weakness, every doubt, every tremor of fear in the candidates before him. Rumor had it that Reeves had personally trained operatives for missions so classified their existence was denied by governments worldwide. More importantly, he had a reputation for psychological warfare that left even seasoned soldiers questioning their abilities. "Welcome to your final assessment," Reeves announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. He gestured toward the table with a casual movement that somehow felt threatening. "What you see before you will determine whether you continue in this program or find yourself reassigned to desk duty for the remainder of your military career." Sarah's eyes focused on the table's contents, and her stomach tightened. An M4A1 carbine lay completely disassembled, its components scattered across the metal surface like the pieces of a deadly jigsaw puzzle. The upper and lower receivers sat at opposite ends of the table. The bolt carrier group had been broken down to its individual parts: bolt, firing pin, cam pin, and retaining pin arranged in no particular order. The charging handle, buffer spring, stock assembly, and trigger components were distributed seemingly at random across the surface. "This weapon has been field stripped beyond standard protocol," Reeves continued, beginning to pace around the table like a predator circling prey. "Every pin has been removed, every spring separated, every component isolated. In combat conditions, you might face exactly this scenario: a damaged weapon that requires complete reconstruction under extreme pressure." Martinez shifted nervously, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the room's cool temperature. Thompson's jaw clenched as he studied the scattered parts, mentally rehearsing assembly procedures. Williams maintained his poker face, but Sarah noticed a slight tremor in his hands. "The standard time for experienced soldiers to perform a complete field assembly is 3 minutes, Reeves announced, his eyes gleaming with something that might have been anticipation. "However, in combat, 3 minutes is an eternity. 3 minutes is the difference between completing your mission and becoming a casualty statistic." He stopped pacing and fixed his gaze on the group, letting the silence stretch until it became almost unbearable. "You have exactly 60 seconds to produce a fully functional weapon. Not 59 seconds. Not 61 seconds. 60 seconds precisely." The candidates exchanged glances, some confident, others clearly rattled. Sarah had performed countless weapon assemblies during her training, but never under such extreme time pressure, and never with a weapon broken down to this degree. "Furthermore," Reeves continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "this is an elimination round. Anyone who fails to complete the assembly in the allotted time will be immediately removed from the program. No second chances. No appeals. No exceptions. The weight of those words settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Months of training, years of preparation, entire military careers hung in the balance of the next 60 seconds. You will approach the table one at a time, in alphabetical order, Reeves instructed. Chun, you're first. Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward her as she stepped forward. The metal table seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the scattered weapon components appearing more complex and numerous than they had moments before. Her heart rate increased, but her breathing remained controlled. A technique drilled into her through countless high-stress scenarios as she approached the table. Studying the layout of parts, an idea began forming in her mind. It was audacious, perhaps even reckless, but it might give her the edge she needed. During her childhood in her father's machine shop, she had learned to work by touch as much as by sight, assembling complex mechanisms in cramped, poorly lit spaces. Later, during survival training, she had practiced equipment maintenance in complete darkness, preparing for scenarios where artificial light might compromise operational security. Instructor Reeves, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. I'd like to request a blindfold. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Martinez actually laughed out loud before catching himself. Thompson shook his head in disbelief. Williams stared at her as if she had just announced her intention to juggle live grenades. Reeves' expression shifted from professional detachment to something approaching genuine surprise, then quickly hardened into suspicion. His pale eyes narrowed as he studied Sarah's face, searching for signs of arrogance, desperation, or mental breakdown. You want to make this more difficult? He asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. You think 60 seconds isn't challenging enough? I believe it will actually improve my performance, sir, Sarah replied, maintaining eye contact despite every instinct telling her to look away. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, the subtle hum of the fluorescent lights, the barely audible breathing of her fellow candidates. Reeves continued to stare at her, his expression unreadable. You understand, he said slowly, that if you fail when you fail, you'll be dismissed from this program immediately. No explanations will be accepted about how the blindfold hindered your performance. I understand. Sir, Reeves studied her for another long moment, then reached into a storage cabinet and withdrew a black tactical blindfold. Very well, Chun. But understand this, I've seen overconfident recruits destroy their careers with exactly this kind of showboating. When you fail, and you will fail, you'll have no one to blame but yourself. He held out the blindfold, his eyes never leaving her face. Last chance to reconsider. Sarah took the blindfold without hesitation. I'm ready, sir. As she tied the fabric securely around her head, plunging herself into complete darkness, she heard Reeves address the room. Let this be a lesson to the rest of you about the dangers of arrogance. Chun has just guaranteed her own failure. But Sarah wasn't listening to his words. She was focusing on her breathing, centering herself, and preparing to trust in abilities she had spent years developing. In the darkness behind the blindfold, she could feel the weight of every gaze upon her, the skepticism, the anticipation of her failure. She stepped toward the table, her fingers already reaching for the scattered components of what would either be her triumph or her downfall. Continue. Sarah's fingertips made contact with the cold metal surface of the table, and instantly the world transformed. In the absolute darkness behind the blindfold, her other senses sharpened to an almost supernatural degree. She could hear the collective intake of breath from the other candidates, smell the gun oil and metal polish that clung to the disassembled weapon, feel the subtle vibrations in the floor as Reeves shifted his weight nearby. Your time begins. Now, Reeves announced, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Sarah's hands moved across the table surface with deliberate precision, her fingers dancing over the scattered components like a pianist finding familiar keys. The lower receiver, she identified it immediately by its distinctive trigger guard and magazine well. Her left hand secured it while her right continued its methodical search. 30 seconds remaining, came Thompson's whispered count. Though Sarah had asked no one to keep time, the bolt carrier group components lay scattered in the center of the table. Sarah's fingers found the bolt first, its distinctive star-shaped chamber immediately recognizable to her touch. The firing pin came next, a slender rod of hardened steel that slid into place with a satisfying click. Her muscle memory took over, movements flowing with the fluid grace of someone who had performed this action thousands of times, but something was different. As her hands worked, Sarah began to notice details that would have been invisible to her eyes. The firing pin had a microscopic burr on its tip, barely perceptible to touch, but potentially catastrophic to weapon function. The bolt's gas rings were slightly misaligned, a defect that would cause cycling problems. These weren't random training weapons. They were deliberately sabotaged. 20 seconds, Martinez breathed, his voice tight with disbelief. Sarah's revelation didn't slow her down. It accelerated her. This wasn't just a test of assembly speed. It was a test of diagnostic ability under extreme pressure. Reeves wasn't just measuring how quickly they could put a weapon together. He was evaluating whether they could identify and correct potentially fatal flaws. While working against an impossible deadline, her fingers flew across the components with renewed purpose. The cam pin slid into the bolt with a precise quarter turn. The retaining pin locked everything in place with a barely audible snap. The bolt carrier group was complete. But Sarah took an extra half-second to ensure the gas rings were properly seated at Bastille, detail that could mean the difference between a functional weapon and a dangerous malfunction. 15 seconds. Williams called out, his voice carrying a note of awe that he couldn't quite suppress. The upper receiver came together next. Sarah's left hand guided the charging handle into its channel, while her right positioned the bolt carrier group. The forward assist and dust cover had been removed, another deliberate complication. She located them by touch, the forward assist distinctive knurled surface immediately identifiable. The dust cover's spring mechanism required precise alignment, but her fingers found the correct position without hesitation. Around her, she could hear the other candidates shifting restlessly. Someone, probably Martinez, was breathing heavily, as if he were the one performing under pressure. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but in Sarah's world of absolute darkness, sound had become her primary navigation tool. 10 seconds, Reeves himself announced, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been surprise. The trigger assembly was the most complex component, a maze of springs, pins, and precisely machined parts that had to align perfectly for the weapon to function safely. Sarah's fingers located the trigger guard and began the delicate process of installing the fire control group. The hammer spring compressed under her touch, its tension exactly what she expected. The trigger spring slid into place with mechanical precision, but again, she detected an anomaly. The sear engagement surface felt wrong, too smooth, lacking the proper texture for reliable function. In combat, this could cause the weapon to fire uncontrollably or fail to fire at all. Without hesitation, she made a microscopic adjustment, using her fingernail to create the proper surface texture. 5 seconds, came a chorus of voices. The other candidates, now completely absorbed in watching what they had assumed would be an inevitable failure. The buffer spring and stock assembly were the final components. Sarah's hands moved with balletic grace, the spring compressing as she guided it into the buffer tube. The stock clicked into place with a solid mechanical sound that echoed through the silent room. 3, 2, 1. Sarah stepped back from the table and reached for her blindfold. But Reeves' voice stopped her. "Leave it on," he commanded, his tone sharp with authority and something else, perhaps suspicion, perhaps disbelief. She heard his footsteps approach the table, then a distinctive sound of metal against metal as he lifted the assembled weapon. The silence stretched endlessly as he performed his inspection, and Sarah could imagine his experienced hands checking every joint, every pin, every surface. "Charging handle," Reeves muttered, and Sarah heard the metallic snap as he tested the action. "Bolt carry and movement, smooth. Forward. Assist, functional." His voice carried a note of grudging approval that he seemed reluctant to acknowledge. The safety selector clicked through its position: safe, semi, full auto. Each transition was crisp and positive, exactly as it should be. Sarah heard him remove the bolt carrier group, inspecting the components she had assembled in darkness. "Gas rings properly seated," he said, his voice now carrying genuine surprise. "Firing pin correctly installed and wait." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's heart rate increased as she wondered if she had made some critical error, some oversight that would invalidate her performance. "The firing pin," Reeves continued slowly. "There was a manufacturing defect, a burr that should have caused feeding problems. It's been corrected." His voice carried a note of confusion, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Sarah heard him reassemble the bolt carrier group and install it back in the upper receiver. The charging handle cycled smoothly, the bolt locking back with a satisfying click. "The sear engagement," Reeves muttered, his voice barely audible. "The surface texture was deliberately compromised during preparation. It's been repaired." The room was so quiet that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. She sensed the other candidates leaning forward, straining to understand what was happening. "Remove the blindfold," Reeves commanded. Sarah untied the fabric and blinked as the harsh fluorescent light flooded her vision. The assembled M4A1 lay on the table before her, looking exactly as it should, a perfectly functional weapon ready for combat deployment. Reeves held the rifle in his hands, his weathered face a mask of conflicting emotions. His pale blue eyes moved from the weapon to Sarah's face and back again, as if trying to solve an impossible puzzle. 15 seconds, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Complete assembly in 15 seconds. With corrections to deliberate sabotage that should have been undetectable without visual inspection." The other candidates stared at Sarah as if she had just performed an act of magic. Martinez's mouth hung open in undisguised amazement. Thompson shook his head slowly, as if trying to clear his vision. Williams simply stared, his professional composure completely shattered. "How?" Reeves demanded, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a whip crack. "How did you detect defects that were specifically designed to be invisible during rapid assembly?" Sarah met his gaze steadily, her breathing still controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She had just accomplished something that should have been impossible, and she could see in Reeves' eyes that he knew it. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah realized that her demonstration had raised more questions than it had answered. The silence in the room stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Reeves continued to hold the assembled rifle, his knuckles wide against the weapon's black polymer stock. His pale eyes never left Sarah's face, searching for some explanation that would make sense of what he had just witnessed. "Clear the room," he commanded suddenly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. "Everyone except Chun. Now." The other candidates hesitated for a moment, clearly reluctant to leave, before understanding what they had just witnessed. Martinez opened his mouth as if to protest, but one look from Reeves silenced him immediately. Within 30 seconds, the room was empty except for Sarah and the instructor who had built his reputation on breaking overconfident recruits. Reeves set the rifle down on the table with deliberate care, then began to pace around Sarah like a predator studying unfamiliar prey. His boots clicked against the concrete floor in a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the tension building between them. 23 years, he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. 23 years I've been running assessments in this room. I've seen Rangers, SEALs, Delta Force operators, and Special Forces veterans attempt that assembly. The fastest time on record was 47 seconds, achieved by a master sergeant with 15 years of weapons experience. He stopped pacing and fixed Sarah with a stare that seemed to penetrate straight through her. You just cut that record by more than half, blindfolded, while correcting sabotage that was specifically designed to be undetectable during rapid assembly. Sarah remained silent, her posture relaxed but alert. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best response was no response at all. The firing pin burr was created using a precision grinding tool, Reeves continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone working through a complex problem. It required magnification to install and should have been impossible to detect by touch alone. The sear engagement surface was chemically etched to remove exactly 0.003 inches of material, modification that would cause catastrophic weapon failure but remain invisible. During standard inspection, he leaned against the table, his eyes never leaving her face. So I'll ask you again, Chun, how? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would either elevate her to a level of respect she had never experienced or mark her as a security risk requiring immediate investigation. The truth was complicated, painful, and would reveal more about her past than she had ever shared with anyone in the military. I wasn't always a soldier. Sir, she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the memories she was about to share. My father owned a precision manufacturing company in San Francisco. We specialized in aerospace components, parts for satellites, guidance systems. Things that had to be perfect because failure meant mission loss and potentially loss of life. Reeves' expression shifted slightly, his suspicion giving way to genuine curiosity. From the time I could hold tools, my father taught me that perfection wasn't just a goal. It was a survival requirement. By age 12, I could detect flaws in machine components that quality control inspectors missed. By 16, I was doing precision work that required tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. She paused, gathering herself for the more difficult part of her story. But that's not where I learned to work in complete darkness. The room seemed to grow colder as Sarah continued. 3 years ago, I was deployed to Afghanistan as part of a logistics support unit. We were supposed to be safely behind the lines, maintaining equipment and coordinating supply runs. On paper, it was a low-risk assignment. Reeves' posture changed subtly, his professional demeanor shifting to something approaching respect. He recognized the tone of someone about to share a combat experience. Our convoy was hit by an IED outside Kandahar, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the flat, emotionless quality that veterans used when discussing trauma. The explosion flipped our vehicle and trapped me in the wreckage for 6 hours before rescue arrived. When they finally pulled me out, I had severe head trauma and complete temporary blindness. She could see understanding beginning to dawn in Reeves' eyes. But she pressed on with her story. The doctor said my sight would return, but it might take weeks or months. Meanwhile, I was stuck in a field hospital with nothing to do but listen to the sounds of war around me. That's when I started asking the armorer if I could help with weapon maintenance. Sarah's hands moved unconsciously as she spoke, her fingers tracing the motions of disassembly and reassembly in the air. At first, he thought I was crazy, a blind soldier wanting to work on weapons, but I convinced him to let me try with unloaded training weapons. I had to learn everything by touch, the weight of each component, the texture of different metals, the sound each part made when it moved. Reeves was listening intently now, his earlier suspicion replaced by professional fascination. For 3 months, I spent 8 hours a day in that armory, working in complete darkness. I learned to detect problems that sighted technicians missed because I had to rely entirely on touch and sound. A firing pin that was worn by .001 inches felt different under my fingers. A spring that had lost 5% of its tension sounded wrong when it compressed. She met Reeves' gaze directly, her voice gaining strength as she continued. When my sight finally returned, I discovered something unexpected. Working in darkness hadn't just maintained my skills, it had enhanced them. My fingers had become more sensitive than any measuring instrument. I could feel flaws that were invisible to the naked eye. The instructor was silent for a long moment, processing what he had heard. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been awe. The psychological evaluation in your file mentions combat-related visual impairment, but it's listed as fully resolved with no lasting effects. Because that's what I told them, Sarah replied simply. The blindness was temporary, but the skills I developed weren't. I realized that admitting to enhanced tactile sensitivity might raise questions about my fitness for duty. Reeves picked up the rifle again, examining it with new understanding. The defects I introduced to this weapon, you didn't just detect them. You corrected them using techniques that shouldn't be possible without specialized tools. My fingernails became my precision instruments, Sarah explained. 3 months of working in darkness taught me to use every part of my hands as measuring devices. I can feel variations in surface texture that are smaller than what most people can see. The instructor set the weapon down and turned to face her fully. Chun, what you've just demonstrated isn't just exceptional skill. It's a capability that could revolutionize how we train soldiers for equipment maintenance under combat conditions. Sarah remained silent, unsure where this conversation was leading. I'm recommending you for immediate transfer to the Advanced Training Development Division. Reeves continued, his voice taking on an official tone. Your unique abilities could be used to develop new training protocols that could save lives in the field. He paused, studying her face carefully. But first, I need to know, are there others? Other soldiers who developed similar capabilities during recovery from combat injuries? Sarah considered the question carefully. During her time in the field hospital, she had met other wounded warriors who had developed extraordinary compensatory abilities. A sniper who had lost hearing in one ear but could now detect wind patterns by feeling air pressure changes. An explosives expert who had lost his sense of smell but could identify chemical compounds by taste alone. Yes, sir, she said finally. There are others. Reeves nodded slowly, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind. Then we have work to do, Chun. Important work. As he reached for his radio to make the calls that would change the trajectory of her military career, Sarah realized that her moment of audacious risk-taking had opened a door she never knew existed. The skills born from trauma and forged in darkness were about to become her greatest asset.